Hey class, today we're going to start talking about inductive arguments. We've already discussed, right? Inductive arguments are arguments by probability. If the premises are true, then they would make the conclusion more probable. So it's not an argument by necessity. It's possible that you can have an inductive argument in the right form with true premises and still have a false conclusion. That's not the case with deductive arguments, right? Deductive arguments are arguments by necessity. If you have true premises in the right form, then the conclusion must be true. In this case, it just makes the truth of the conclusion more likely. Most arguments are inductive. It's very hard to have an argument by necessity. It's a lot easier to have arguments by probability. So I think a lot of times in the real world, what we're trying to do is say, we want to get to the truth. We're not going to know it fully, but we want to have good arguments, good evidence, and good logic that will help us get closer to the truth, that will give us the best chance, right, of knowing what the truth is. So I think of, like, if you're a juror and you're trying to assess whether someone's guilty or innocent, you're probably not going to know with certainty. You're going to have some evidence. You're going to have the defense that tells you how their explanation of the evidence. You're going to have the prosecution give their explanation of the evidence. You're going to weigh that out and say, which of these arguments makes the most sense on the whole, is the most comprehensive, is the most clear. And I'm going to make a judgment that I think approximates the truth, is the most probable or likely, given what I've been handed, right? Given what I've heard, what I've seen. Basically, we're jurors in life. All of life, I'm a juror. I read a book. I'm trying to figure out, is the argument strong? Does the data support the conclusion? Do I think this is likely true? Or I read a newspaper, or I listen to a political candidate, or I go to church and I listen to a pastor. I'm a juror. I don't just accept these things, right? I should have critical thinking skills. I should engage and have a dialogue and ask hard questions, either literally ask questions or in my own mind, right? Having a dialogue with the text or as the sermon's going on, so that we're trying to get close to the truth as much as we can. And so that's inductive arguments, probabilistic arguments. They take many forms. Today we're going to talk about two inductive forms, very common ones. One is generalization. That's a kind of inductive argument. The other is a syllogism, a different kind of inductive argument. They're similar. They're almost mirror images of each other. Okay? So if I'm going to make a generalization, I'm going to start with some specific information, and I'm going to move to a more generalized conclusion. So the generalization moves from specific to general. Syllogism works a little differently. A syllogism starts with a very general premise, right? General statements, and then works to a more specific conclusion. Okay? So generalization works from the specific to the general. Syllogism works from the general to the more specific. Okay? And this will make sense as we go through examples. I'm going to share my screen so we can look at some that this might take. So this is sort of a general form of, the generic form of a generalization. X% of observed F's or G's. Observed is the more specific here. Conclusion, X% of all F's or G's. So we go from observation to all, more specific to general, right? The conclusion is more general than the premise. An example might be 90% of observed accountants are boring, or 90% of the accountants we surveyed are boring. Conclusion, 90% of all accountants are boring. So from a set of observations or research or data collection, surveys or whatnot, we then make a conclusion about the whole. You can imagine that, again, this is not certain, this is probabilistic, okay? Another example, several reliable polls show that between 5 and 7% of the US population self-identifies as homosexual. From this, we conclude that probably between 5 and 7% of the US population is homosexual. Premise is a set of observations based on polls and data. Then we make a conclusion that's more general. Every election cycle, this happens. Pollsters will call people within a given city or a given state, and they'll say, well, based on the people that we polled, 60% support Donald Trump, 40% support Hillary Clinton. We project that the entire state of Idaho or Washington or wherever will vote in this way. So we might have only polled 10,000 people in the state of 2 million, and we're going to make a generalization about how everyone will vote. Now, as you know, with elections, polls are actually really accurate, right? We often get a pretty good sense of it, but it's not certain. It's inductive, it's not deductive, so mistakes are made. Polls can end up being wrong. So they're right a lot of the time, but they're not right every time. So that gives you a good sense of what an inductive argument does. It gives us a probability. This is most likely what will happen given the polls, but we can't guarantee it. Things, it's only probabilistic. How do I judge a generalization? This is important, right? So you can make a generalization, but how do I judge it versus to be strong or weak, highly probable or less probable? And this is the why. So if you tell me that a generalization is strong, if I ask why is it strong, you have to relate to the criteria that you see on the screen right now, right? If you tell me a generalization is weak, and I say why, you've got to relate to this set of criteria on the screen right now, okay? If you make a generalization, you're going to want to make a strong one, right? So use this criteria. So one, what's the sample? So if I say we took polls and 90%, 90% of accountants are boring in the sample, is the sample large enough? So did I go out and ask, observe 10 accountants and 9 of them were boring, and then I made a judgment about all accountants? If so, the sample size is too small. There's probably thousands, I know it, thousands and thousands of accountants. If I only looked at 10, then that's not a good enough sample, right? I'm gonna have to get a larger sample size. Now, if I looked at 10 in one city, and then I tried to say, 90% of accountants in Boise are boring, well, then the sample size is a little bit better. I'm not generalizing all accountants. I'm only looking at accountants in a particular region. And so now the sample size may be large enough, right? It's the same thing where if I'm trying to look at a presidential election and I only poll 5,000 people, that might not be big enough. But if I was looking at only a local election where very few people vote and I got a sample size of 5,000, well, that might be a really big sample and it might be large enough. So depending on the conclusion, am I talking about every accountant? Am I only talking about accountants in this particular firm? Am I only talking about accountants, in Idaho? Depending on the conclusion and the size of my conclusion, the sample may or may not be large enough, okay? So there's a sliding scale, there's a gray area. But based on your conclusion, you want to make sure you have a large enough sample. The other condition of strength is, does the sample have enough variety, right? Is it diverse given my conclusion, okay? So let's say I camped outside of the Republican National Convention. And as people left, I polled people and I asked them what they thought about gun control. And I say, man, my poll shows that 98%, right? 98% of the people I polled are against gun control. I bet 98% of the American population is against gun control, right? There's a problem in my sample because I only polled people coming out of the Republican National Convention. That's not a diverse sample. That's a sample where almost everyone is going to have a similar belief about gun control. So if I'm going to have an effective generalization, I need to poll Republicans and Democrats and old people and young people, and right, because I'm trying to make a conclusion about how Americans feel about gun control. And if that's my conclusion, then I've got to get a diverse sample: age, race, economic status, political view, religious view. If I have a diverse sample, then I can make a bigger conclusion, right? However, if my conclusion is, what do Republicans feel about gun control, right? And my conclusion is limited to Republicans. Then if I were to poll people coming out of the Republican National Convention, I might be able to say 98% of the Republicans polled are against gun control. The vast majority of Republicans are against gun control. So again, the sample size and the diversity of sample have to match, have to fit your conclusion. Okay? That's vital. Part of the skill here is learning how to make language fit. If 75% of all NNU students polled really like Dr. McKinney's class, then I could conclude that many NNU students like Dr. McKinney. That would be a good way to fit. 75% equals many. That there's a balance there. But if 75% students polled like Dr. McKinney, and then I said, therefore, all students like Dr. McKinney, that doesn't work. 75% and all don't fit. The conclusion is overstating the data. You want to use words that like many, most, a lot, good chance, strong conclusion. You want to use words like that fit the data. You don't want to overstate your conclusion in generalizations. Okay. Some common mistakes related to generalizations, fallacies related to generalizations. One is a hasty generalization, and this is where our sample size is too small. Okay. So this happens a lot with our personal experience. We'll say something like, I've been pulled over by 2 cops and they were both jerks. Cops are jerks. I've taken a sample size of 2 and then I've made a generalization about all, right? You don't want to do that. That's a really bad generalization. It's a fallacy. Most stereotypes are predicated on this, right? So we run into I don't know, a female who's not a good driver, and we say, aha, see, look, women aren't good drivers, or something like that. We make some gender-based stereotype on a tiny sample size that does gross damage to an entire gender, right? So that's a hasty generalization. Racial stereotypes are like this. Political stereotypes are often like this. You want to make sure you have good information, good evidence, and that you can make a good generalization from it. You don't want to have a tiny sample size and then overstate it. Biased statistics, this is when, again, we poll only Republicans, but then we make a generalization about the whole of Americans, right, and what they believe. It's biased because I'm only looking at one demographic, right? If I only interviewed Christians and polled Christians and got data about Christians, but then I tried to make a conclusion about how everyone feels about God, say, that would be a biased sample, right? So you want to make sure that your sample is diverse in proportion to your conclusion. If my conclusion is only about Christians, then my poll can focus only on Christians. But if my conclusion is about all people or all Americans, then I need to focus on a diverse sample. The last thing that happens often is misleading vividness. This is where we allow a more recent experience to paint the whole, to override data. This happens to me, like I'll get on a plane and I'll start to feel scared and I'll feel like driving is safer than flying, right? My fear allows me to do that, but all the data suggests you're way safer flying somewhere than driving. There's a lot more car accidents. People die a lot more in car accidents than in flights. So I'm allowing my feelings to override, right? Or maybe, I watch an Oprah Winfrey show about a kid getting kidnapped, and I'll allow that vivid fear to not allow my son to ride his bike to school anymore, right? Even though, again, the odds of him being kidnapped are so low. I don't allow the evidence to lead me to good conclusions. I allow some vivid experience to paint that picture instead. Often when we've had traumatic experiences, this begins to happen, right? So that's generalizations. I hope that's helpful. I want to talk a little bit about statistical syllogisms. I'm going to call them syllogisms. They're very similar to generalizations, but they're a little bit different, right? Because instead of moving from a more specific premise to a general conclusion, we're going to move from a general premise to a specific conclusion, right? So the general form for a syllogism is X% of all B's or G's, right? That's general. X% of all B's or G's That's like a generalization there. Premise 2, A is a B. Conclusion, A is probably a G. You need to know this general form, and then we'll look at specific examples. When you hear something referred to as the referent class in a syllogism, that's typically a noun. In this case, it's a B, right? Up top, if you look at the B, X% of all B's are G's. The attribute class is usually the G up top. It's usually an adjective. So if you look at a specific example, 85% of all baseball players are Latin. Baseball players here is the referent class here, the B. Baseball players, the referent. Latin descent is the attribute class. Okay, so 85% of baseball players are Latin. John is a baseball player. Conclusion, it is likely that John is of Latin descent. 85% and likely fit, right? So if the premises are true, the conclusion is supported here. You're moving from a generalization, 85% of all baseball players are Latin, to something specific about John. So we're going from the general to the specific in a syllogism rather than from the specific to the general in a generalization. You could see how a generalization and a syllogism might work together. For instance, imagine this. 85% of all baseball players, 85% of the baseball players we polled were of Latin descent. Therefore, 85% of all baseball players are of Latin descent. That's a generalization, right? Now, we take that generalization, we make it a premise. 85% of baseball players are of Latin descent. John is a baseball player, therefore John is likely Latin. Syllogism. Often generalizations and syllogisms go together. We do a poll, we make a generalization, we take that generalization, we apply it to a specific person, and we get a probable outcome, right? 90% of all Democrats polled are pro-choice. Therefore, 90% of all Democrats are most likely pro-choice. You know, Deborah is a Democrat. Deborah is probably pro-choice. That's the way a generalization and a syllogism would work together. Another example of a syllogism. Almost all biologists argue for the truth of macroevolution, which is true, by the way. Professional biologists, it's like 96% advocate macroevolution. Premise 2, Susan is a biologist. Conclusion, Susan will most definitely support evolution, right? If almost all biologists support it, then most definitely would fit. Most definitely would not fit 75% of biologists, right? You want your conclusion to fit the evidence. So if it was 75% of biologists argue for the truth, most definitely would not be good, maybe probably would be good there, right? You want to make sure those fit. How do I judge a syllogism? How do I know whether it's strong or weak? This is, again, answering the why question. If I was to ask you, why is the syllogism strong or weak, you need to give me some good reasons. So what is the percentage? When I say 85% of baseball players are Latin, John is a baseball player, John is probably Latin. 85 is a good percentage. If it's 50, then it's not going to be as helpful to me, right? So you want to, again, make sure that the language fits. If it's 50% of Latin, baseball players are Latin, John is a baseball player, then I would say, there's a 50% chance, there's a good chance John is Latin or something like that. You want to make it match. Do we have all of the evidence? So imagine if I said something like 85% of baseball players are Latin. Ichiro Suzuki is a baseball player, therefore Ichiro Suzuki is probably Latin. Well, now we have to take into account this new evidence because we know that Ichiro is not a Latin name. Ichiro is an Asian name. And so in this case, it's not a very good syllogism, right? So that's important. 75% of people living in Boise are under the poverty line. John, who is a private defense attorney for the most prestigious law firm in Boise, lives in this area. Therefore, John is probably poor too. Not a good syllogism because information about the fact that he's a private defense attorney for the most prestigious law firm tells us that he's probably not poor, right? So sometimes there's evidence that we would want to use to determine whether or not the syllogism is strong or weak. Often in syllogisms, we're referencing experts like biologists that support macroevolution, right? And so we want to ask ourselves, is this group really qualified to be an expert in this field? Because you can argue to authorities, you can appeal to authorities in ways that are fallacious, in ways that are not strong. So you want to make sure if you're using experts that they actually fit the definition, right? They have the proper education, proper experience, proper credentialing boards, right? That have said, yes, this person is, they passed the bar exam, they have their CPA license, right? They are in fact experts. That's vital, okay? Some common fallacies related to syllogisms. Evidence is ignored, like 85% of baseball players are Latin, Ichiro Suzuki, is a baseball player. You're ignoring his name, right? We can appeal to authorities in problematic ways. Like my pastor said, well, does your pastor, has he been to school? Does he know Hebrew and Greek and the history of it? Can he engage the text at a level of depth, or is he someone that felt called to lead a church and so he does? Not that that wouldn't give him some authority, but it wouldn't make your pastor necessarily an authority in issues of scripture or theology, right? That would require more than just feeling called, but that, again, there's an education and experience and expertise there. So we can do this in fallacious ways. We want to make sure we do it in strong ways. So the correct way to appeal to authority, if we're going to do that, right? Most of what authority A says about subject is correct and accepted. Person A says X about S, X is probably true, right? This is the form that appeal to authority should take. Again, authority A, whether it's a person or group, needs to actually be an expert in the appropriate field. But once they are, then this generic form should hold, right? Another way of looking at syllogisms is to say we have argument by consensus. When a majority of people say something about subject S, it is usually true. The majority of people say X about S, X is probably true. Again, consensus is only reliable when the people being referenced are in authority. The masses are often wrong about things, right? Uneducated public is often wrong about things. But when the majority of a given group of people say, something about a topic and those people are reliable experts, then that often ends up being something reliable. Not guaranteed. Experts can be wrong. A consensus of experts can be wrong. That's why it's inductive. But it hedges our bets towards the truth, being more reliable on the whole. So as you engage generalizations and syllogisms, if you have any questions at all for me, please let me know. And I will look forward to seeing you online.